Welcome everyone to the December 11th, 2024 Finance Subcommittee of the Brookline School Committee. Before we begin, I'm just going to make one quick remark about sort of everything that we'll be talking about today and just give a little bit of a blanket remark, which is just that there are some unsubstantiated allegations that have been made, and I think that it is fair to ask if they will be investigated, but I would ask that everyone who's participating today in this meeting not to take them as fact until such time as they are substantiated. They're still allegations at this point. So with that said, I'm going to move right into the substance of the meeting. And the first item on the agenda is the minutes of, sorry, whatever month it is, November something.
It was the
November
November
13th.
13th meeting.
Thank you. Can I get a motion for approval?
So moved.
Thanks. Is there a second?
Yes.
Okay. Carolyn, how do you vote?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
Val?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Next item on the agenda, there is no grant applications for approval, so the next one is acceptance of grants. And we have, I'm trying to find it, I think one grant for 17,000 that has been made to Brookline Adult and Community Education from the Mass Cultural Council. And so that is a general grant that is unrestricted for the use of BASE. And so can I get a motion for approval?
I'll move it.
Okay, any second?
I'll second.
Okay, any questions, comments?
Do they tend to get that? Does Mass Cultural Council, is that every other year?
I'm not sure, but if I recall correctly, this is a new,
Oh, good.
yeah, a new thing.
Great.
And I don't know if it'll be recurring. But I believe I saw in my email that it was not a sort of standard one.
Okay.
Carolyn, how do you vote?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
Val?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Next item on the agenda is the acceptance of gifts. There is a anonymous gift for $25 to Brookline High School and the Queer Student Union. Thank you to the donor. Can I get a motion for acceptance?
I'll move that.
Okay, do I have a second?
Yes, I'll second.
Okay, Val, how do you vote?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Okay, next item on the agenda is review of position control report. Before we take a look at that, I just want to flag for people that we're going to remove the Chief of Strategic Initiatives from the conversation for tonight. The position is still going through some modifications. It's in draft mode, and there's some questions that staff are still looking to get answers for. So we will, we can talk about the position control report, but let's park that conversation until it's ready for a full discussion. So with that said, Betsy, do you mind pulling up the position control report?
Sure. One minute.
Thank you. Sarah?
When I see a classroom teacher on this, does that mean that they're coming in mid-year and we're dividing a class in the month of December?
Susan's here, so I'll let her answer your question. And where are you looking at, just so I'm clear? I don't see a classroom teacher in December, so I'm confused.
Oh, grade 4 teacher at Hayes.
That's September or August. If you look at the date,
Oh,
the
sorry.
report, yeah,
Okay, so I see.
it's the
Okay.
last column. It's sort of
And
most
is
recent to earliest.
Is that something we're approving to happen in August, or is that something that was added in August?
We already looked at that. That was from last August.
Okay, I see now that final column. And so it's funny because I opened this today and I was very surprised to see things that I thought we had talked about before, and I didn't understand that part. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Can I ask a question, Maria?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm just unclear on what the difference between the director of Winthrop House, what that restructuring is.
Susan, are you able to, there you are. I can't hear you. You're not on mute. Oh, now maybe if you get really close.
How about now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So previously there was a position titled Program Coordinator, Winthrop House, that was high school only. And when the school committee approved adding Winthrop House at the middle school level, then there was a negotiation that took place to eliminate the program coordinator dash Winthrop House from the BEU contract and to make this a director position that now
Okay.
reports to OSS.
And this is right. This is the person that's covering both programs. Got it. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? That was done like months and months ago. I remember it's Sarah Apollo, right? She was introduced to us even in the fall. So do you have any, is there any background you can provide on why it's showing up now as opposed to at some
Yes.
earlier point?
So this report is constructed based on what comes to me in what month, not necessarily when an action's taken. So the paperwork to eliminate that and move it from the high school position over to a district position was done in December, for this December report. I didn't have it previously.
I see.
So in other words, when this was approved, I believe it was in early July, was prior to my return. And the position control that was set up for the coordinator position at the high school. And so it needed to be changed. So I'm just saying it was a timing issue, not that it was not implemented when agreed upon.
I see.
Catching up on paperwork.
Okay. But has the pay been going according to the previously agreed upon rate?
I don't know what the,
Because there's a net cost difference here. That's all I'm just
Yes.
wondering is, okay,
Yes.
okay. Are there other questions on position control report for now?
I think I'm gonna ask, because it's Sarah's question makes me sort of look at this anew, and sort of be cognizant of that we've got August, September, October, November, December. So if we're seeing this, is it fair to assume that these positions are up and running, I guess is my word, and or that they're requested? Does that,
They're up and running.
okay. And
Can I ask a follow-up question on that though? When you say up and running,
Except for
do you
this
mean
chief of-
budgeted or do you mean filled? Like,
filled, like that there's,
no, I know that's why I'm asking what Susan meant because I think you were
Oh.
differentiating between budget and filled and I wasn't sure if Susan was.
Right. Budget was what I was, if the position's up and running and budgeted, that's what I was referring to.
and I'm sorry, but because I'm sure we went over this last time, but so when we look at like the November where there are 4 TBDs, that's just sort of like, we'll have to reconcile that at some point.
Thank you for asking that. It's a great question. So as you know from the last meeting, we have a salary deficit that we've identified. And there was some reconciliation that had not been completed for the IDEA grant, which I'm going to speak to in a little bit.
Oh, okay.
And so all of it's kind of related. In order to be able to reconcile out the salaries, I have to be able to reconcile out the grants, because if something's being charged to a grant, then that's one thing. If it's being not charged to a grant, then it moves into
Okay,
the budget, right? And so
okay,
we're still
okay,
trying to go through that
okay.
process.
Thank you, thank
Mhm.
you.
If there's no more questions, I think that's a good transition point to go to the update on FY25, if that works for you too, Susan.
It does, but I did my slide deck.
Oh, the
with
other way around.
report. Sorry. So,
Do you think we
Uh,
can start in the middle or should we just, or
no,
should
no, no,
we?
no, I can, we can go, I don't have, yeah.
No, why don't
so
you go ahead and do your thing in the order
that's
you're
it.
going to do it in. Let me just preface this by saying because we are going through we decided to defer the conversation on base and beep. There was a lot that's going on in the 26 and 25 budget, and we wanted to make sure we had enough time to focus on these bigger issues. And because of the big conversations about 26 and 25, some of the loops weren't closed with some of the folks feeding information on the fees. So we'll park the fees conversation for now for 26. We'll look at the status of 26 and then 25. And that will be the bulk of the rest of our conversation today is the 26 forecast and the 25 update. Thank you, Susan. Go ahead.
And
Yeah,
sorry, I'm gonna jump in super quick. On Betsy and Susan, will these slides show up in the meeting materials later?
They will.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just got them a couple minutes ago, so I apologize. We'll get
Yep.
them up to you.
No problem, just thank you.
And we can do the 25 first. It's on slide 8, Betsy, if you want to go there, I can just give the update on that. That's not a problem. And then we can go, because I really want to step through the 26 and I want everyone to have the opportunity to really ask questions so that I hope we walk away with, common understanding of what it means and where the numbers are coming from. So let's get this piece out of the way and I can answer questions about it. But
Okay.
if you
Betsy,
remember,
can you change the view to presenter view? We're seeing speaker view right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, let me just,
I think it was on the same screen you're on under the display settings. If you go back to the presentation mode.
do you see it, Mariah? Am I missing it? I don't usually use.
No, click on
PowerPoint.
from current slide and then where, let's see if it works now. And if it doesn't, you go up to this presentation display settings, click on that top thing up there.
I have someone here helping me. 1 sec.
Okay. The display settings, it's right there.
Oh, sorry.
So it's just right here. Is that it? Or is that still the same view?
It's still the same presenter view, but if you click on display settings, that black in the black bar at the top. No, where you were, right where you were in the presentation mode.
So I'm seeing something a little different than you, so I apologize.
Okay, see where in the middle where it says monitors, see how you have used presenter view? Click checked there, uncheck that, and hopefully, oh, not that one, to the right. Yeah, that.
Great.
Uncheck that
Thank
and
you.
then do it. It should work too.
Excellent.
There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariah.
thank you for the tutorial, Mariah.
Sorry, it's just hard to read. It's a lot of data to not be able to see big.
It is, it is. So I always like to start with something that you might find familiar in order to kind of ground us a little bit. And so at the last table that was in the financial report that was presented at the last meeting was this one. And this just simply summarized all of the cost centers into salary and expense. And so I thought I would just kind of bring us back to that. On the salaries, as we talked about last time, we have a salary deficit of basically little south of $1.2 million identified. And to remind you, a component of that was this extra compensation piece, and that made up about 750,000 of that. And then the balance of that is attributed to holding on to some salary money for unfilled positions. And as we go through the year, we will then release some of the salary money because the positions will go unfilled, and we call that breakage, okay? So I believe that the breakage piece will resolve itself, and we'll have a better sense of that at the next quarterly report, because as we move through the year, we don't have to keep holding salaries for positions for the remainder of the year, if that makes sense. So just to bring us back to that, there were a couple of items that were kind of follow-up. And one we had mentioned was that the IDEA grant, which is the federal government's contribution to our special education students, had not been reconciled. So the grant had been submitted and we hadn't received the detail to be able to tie it out to the FY25 spending plan. Before the financial team releases the grant, we go through and make sure that everything's in order. That's their job. And we didn't have the detail that we needed in order to finish that reconciliation. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. So we've, been at work trying to move through the reconciliation. And one of the things that we learned was that there was some difficulties in the FY24 IDEA grant, meaning that there was more money allocated and expense to it than we have in grant money. So we received a note from DESE also saying that 369,000 needed to be set aside and spent for to address the disproportionality kind of finding from a couple, I think 2 fiscal years back. And as we went through and started looking at the expenses, we hadn't expended the 369,000. So we've been working with them. In fact, Diane and I were on a phone call with the OSS office manager and DESE today, kind of going through, okay, how do we address what their needs are and what does it mean for grant modifications? I say all of this because once we get that reconciled off for 24, whatever expenses are no longer applicable to that, then that has to come back into the operating budget. So it's kind of a reconciliation that is now crossing 2 years, and we haven't completed the work. The FY25 grant was submitted with different and new expenses that were not considered during the FY25 budget process. And so staff that were allocated to the grant when we went through the budget process will now need to be shifted back to the general fund, or the grant will need to be rewritten to comport with the approved spending plan for 25. And so that work has not been completed, but in the end, whatever expenses are above and beyond what we have in the 24 and 25 grant will then need to be moved into the operating budget. And that could be an additional $1 to $1.5 million. I don't have the final numbers on that. We will have to work through that. And so what I'm recommending, because disproportionality really is addressed through programming to, generally speaking, all students, that also targets interventions that will address and improve the outcomes for our identified population. So what I'm recommending is that 2 members of the OSS team, 2 members of OTL, and 2 members of OAF convene and go through each grant, make sure that we are clear about what expenses apply, so that we can make sure that we're conforming in 25 and also in service to 26 as we're preparing that. Because again, if historical salaries that have been charged to a grant are no longer going to be charged to a grant, then it has to move over to the operating budget. And so until that reconciliation's done and completed, I can't really give you a final number there. So that's really where we're at with that. Funding for extra compensation.
Can I ask a question on that one?
I was going to
first?
say, go ahead. I think Val's question on that. Go ahead, Val.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so I'm unclear about the budgetary impact, or if there even is one. Because the IDEA grant doesn't fund anywhere near what we spend on special education. I'm just trying to wrap my head around whether there is an actual budget increase or decrease depending upon how that reconciliation goes, or whether it's just an accounting exercise that will be cumbersome that we need to go through, but won't really change our bottom line picture. Right? Are we just moving people from grant to non-grant who are with us anyway? Or is there some real budgetary impact to having classified things differently?
That's a great question. And so in this case, if in fact what we were doing is saying these 10 staff members are moving off the grant and these 10 staff members are moving on the grant, then it would be budget neutral. But that's not the situation. So let me give you an example. The summer school program cost $712,000. There was only a little over $500,000 budgeted. And so the difference between that's going to have to be funded either through the grant or through the operating budget. And so when we get the reconciliation done, there will be expenses that bleed back into the operating budget. I just can't tell you until the reconciliation is done exactly what that number will be. So that's an example.
But I guess wouldn't then that mean that a cost that we thought was going to be in the operating budget was I guess I'll just hold off until we see the numbers of the reconciliation, but just the IDEA amount is so small compared to what we spend on special ed that it's hard for me to understand that we would be overspent between all of our buckets. But maybe
Susan, isn't it the case though that, for example, and maybe Val, let's say that, again, this will depend on the examples, but OSS thought 10 staff members were going there, and OAF thought a different 10 staff members were going there. And so possibly the total could be whatever, I think we heard 1.2 or 1.5 or whatever the amount is. And then of that, essentially all of it was almost like double counted, Val.
yeah.
And so it could be, while it's not a huge number in our overall amount, it could significantly increase our salary deficit for this year. Am I accurately representing, Susan, sort of?
That's an example.
And as one example, and your ESY example is another example of either overspending on the grant or double, or people thinking of different people were funded. Helen, your hand is up.
Yeah, so rather than going back and forth on this, when will we know? When will this group get together that I see as being recommended here to go over it? And be able to come, will they be able to come back to us next month with the reconciliation? Is that the plan?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
We just can't do it in a vacuum. It requires, conversation.
Yeah, you need to, all the different parties need to be at the table. I get it.
Can I ask a follow-up question too, Susan? The recommendation that you offered a couple of minutes ago also goes retroactively through FY24. So are you anticipating possible changes in the in FY24, or is this more like a forensic just to see if there's other things we should be watching out for 25 and 26?
Yeah, so the grants run a different fiscal year than our operating budget. And so the FY24 grant actually can remain open until September of 25. So some of it.
Okay, so you'd be on like a no cost extension period for the grants or something like that.
Yeah,
okay.
So it's just that there's in two different, the grant year is different than our fiscal year. And so we won't be having to go back and modifying anything related to our FY24 operating budget. It's just between all the buckets, to Val's point, to be between all of the buckets that we have, there has to be sufficient money allocated for all of the expenses that we're going to incur. And that's what, and right now we know that we're short 1.6 million, $1,160,000 short already. We got to figure out how we're going to close that. And then there's this piece of reconciliation work that needs to be done that will influence how we close it and what the final amount is that needs to be adjusted. So
Okay, and next month you'll have, you hope to have
Yep.
that information. Okay,
that's with this team together, we'll be able to address the DESI issues. We'll have clarity around what's where and what we can fund through the various mechanisms. And then that will then present what might bleed over into the operating accounts. But I
Thank-
can't tell you until that work's done, so I don't want to. But I also wanted to flag it because I don't want you to be surprised if we get to January and the number's different. Because then people will say, well, you said 2 months ago that it was this, and when I see something, I like to share it with you. Since I was giving you an update on the budget, I figured it was important to do that.
Thank you. Stephen?
Thanks. Hi, Susan. I just didn't understand the bottom line answer to Val's question. Was the answer that we don't yet know if it's budget neutral?
I don't believe from everything that I've seen so far that it is budget neutral.
Okay. And the extent of the impact won't be determined until after you've convened that group to assess it.
To assess it and make the adjustments necessary so that we have clarity.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Susan, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Right. Okay, is there any other questions about that? Okay, so now if we can go back up. And I'm really gonna take a
Did we
slow.
interrupt you? I feel like we interrupted you on the extra comp. I think we interrupted before you
Oh.
talked about that. Sorry.
Okay, all right. So on the extra comp funding, what we're doing is we're examining the use of one-time special revenue funds to be able to pay for the unfunded expenses. That's a one-year thing, right? These expenses are part of our programming and will need to be funded next year. And so what that means is that what we're doing is taking one-time revenue to fund a recurring cost, which then creates what we call a structural deficit, meaning that next year we're going to have to fund it in full. And so some of the, like Helen and I had met and gone over some of the private grants because they've been sitting on our books for a while, so that we have an understanding of what we might be able to use. An example of that is the craft fund that we have about 68,000 in was gifted to us for the calculus project, and we didn't fund the calculus project in our base budget for 25. So we'll be able to marry that expense with that. Similarly, the overage that we had identified in the athletic program, we should be able to use the balance in their revolving fund to cover that. So we're going through the process of identifying what private grants and revolving funds that we can use to be able to help mitigate or eliminate that portion of the deficit. So we haven't finished that work yet either, but kind of that's the direction we're going in to cover that, because there isn't, with a revenue, with a salary deficit, there really isn't money this early in the year to be able to target transferring from one area to another. So that's our strategy there. Any questions?
So that's to whittle away at the 750,000 that's within the $1.157 million salary deficit, correct? Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Any other questions before we move ahead? Okay.
All right, so we'll start at the top. So this is very hot off the press, and the town presented the financial plan at the select board meeting yesterday. And so we all kind of saw this at the same time. And I took some excerpts from that I thought would be really germane to the school, and thought I would try to help explain some of the numbers that were discussed at that meeting. So first I want to start with the town school split. So is everybody familiar with this town school split, or should I do a little primer on that?
I think it
Anybody?
would be helpful if you gave a 40,000 foot 2-minute overview on that.
Okay, great. So the way the town school split works, and this is like very high level, is that a revenue estimate is developed by the town, and it's a gross revenue number. And then subtracted out of that are certain what they call non-departmental fixed costs. So oftentimes you'll hear it referred to as costs above the line. So that would include like benefits and some policy pieces that the community has adopted. So those things are funded first. They're subtracted off this gross revenue number to come up with a net revenue number. So the net revenue number is the revenue number that is below the line. Then this revenue
That's
is
the one that's labeled available for town school, right? That's the net revenue you're
Correct.
referring to? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, and then using their formula, they determine what percentage goes to the town and what percentage goes to the school. And they allocate that net number. So if you look at the little box down below, you see town and then you see school. And you see in FY25, there's $136,847,618. That is our appropriation for this year. So you'll see that number in our financial reports. That's the number that was approved at town meeting for schools. The number next to it is what they're telling us is the amount of money or revenue that's available to support our expenses next year. So what they're telling us is that revenue on the school side is going to be allocated $2,779,844. So that's what they're saying we have to balance off to. So I'm going to stop there for a minute and see if everybody followed me or if anybody has any questions about that. Because I'm going to refer back to some of these numbers throughout this next couple of slides. Is everybody clear? So there's
I have one question on the,
Yeah.
I always forget this every year and I ask the same question. On the above, does that include our costs too for health and benefits, or is that only town side?
It includes all benefit costs, school and town.
Great, thanks.
Okay, yep. Any other questions? Okay, so what they're telling us at this point is that the revenue estimate is 139,627,462. So I'm going to give you a preview of what I'm going to cover in a slide down below. When you went for the override, this number was higher. So I'm going to park that thought right now, and I'm going to come back to it in a little bit. And I'm going to show you what, when you went through your override process, what you were anticipating you would have for a budget, okay? Because the number that you were anticipating is higher than this number. And it was also higher last year than what we actually received. And this is important because when they talk about the school, the gap for the school is $6 million, you need to understand what's driving that. Okay, and I want to walk you through how that $6 million breaks out, because it's not breaking out just solely by our expenses being dramatically different. We're not $6 million more in spending. Part of the $6 million issue is because the revenues are lower. And I'm going to walk you through the components of that as I understand them. Okay, so if we're all good here, we'll go on to the next slide. So this is the next slide they presented. So you can see that they're showing that the expenditure growth in the school side is $8.8 million. So I wanted you to know where that number comes from. So when Melissa puts together her projection, she does the revenue and then she does the expense, and she asks everyone to give, I call it a thumbnail estimate. It's a really high level estimate. It's not based on complete dollar to dollar tying out of the budget for next year. In fact, budgets are being turned in this week on the school side, so we don't even have our budget built for 26 yet. So how does this number come about? We take that 136,847,609 that was allocated to us for this year. And if we say our costs are increasing by 5%, the increase would be 6,842,380. So why you say 5%? So there's a couple of things that make that a reasonable number. One is that historically, this is the placeholder that has been used, right? From all of my predecessors, according to Melissa, they've always done their estimate based on 5%. That's not good enough for me. What everybody else does doesn't, you know, I have to have something a little more solid for myself. And so when I look at breathing costs of contracts, typically your step and column movement in a school district will run you maybe 3%. And then if I say, okay, in addition to 3%, we've settled most contracts. Please note that AFSCME contracts, so our non-BEU contracts are open this year. But we still, let's say, our estimate that they'll go up 2%, right? So that equals 5. So I think that 5 is not unreasonable. It could be 6, it could be 4.5, you know, when we get all said and done. And I will tell you what that number is when we actually build the budget, what percent our salaries have increased and what the components of that are, but I don't have that yet. So that's the 5%. So if we add the 5% increase to the budget we have this year, it comes to 143,689,989. And then this is all of these are placeholders. If our structural deficit moving into next year is $2 million, which it could very well be. The estimated expense for next year, because we have to pay for those costs that are unfunded this year, would be 689,989. So if you take this number here, the 145, and you subtract it from the 136, it gives you 8.842. This is where Melissa's getting her number of 8.8. Our expenses increasing 8.8. It's nothing more scientific than that. Any questions about that? Because I want you to know when these are online and people are looking at it, where does that number come from?
My question is, can you just explain the source of the $2 million structural deficit number? Is that like the 750 in stipends and some other things? And if so, what are the other things?
Yeah, it's the other things I just talked about, right? So when I'm looking at what our exposure is from the grants, I'm being conservative on this. I'm saying an additional 1.2 is reasonable at this point based on the work I've done and what I can see right now. Could be higher, it could be lower, just like the 5% could be higher, could be lower. But that's
so it's the 750 in stipends plus the 1.2 of the grant. Is that
exactly
correct? Okay.
Of multiple grants, like,
Okay.
yeah, not one grant, but
Susan, this is the year in the BU contract, if I recall, that there's an extra 1% on the last day of this fiscal year 26. Is that some other percent?
so that 5% could be an underestimate.
Well, I'm
haven't-
not sure. I'm asking if you looked at the contract recently, if that's.
I
if where that
can't get it, and I will when we roll the staffing plan.
Okay.
We'll review that.
Okay,
And if that's true, then I'll call that out as well.
thanks.
Susan,
Yes.
do the other bars in this graph have similar percentage expenditure growth ratios?
I don't know because this isn't my slide. This is Melissa's, and I don't know what's behind her number. I just
Okay.
wanted you, the school department, to and school committee and anybody on here to understand where our number came from.
I guess I'm wondering how this is being received. Does this look like the school budget growth is outstripping the growth of other parts of the town? Or does it look like it's growing in parallel with the town school split?
I don't
You
have
could
any.
calculate it off the previous slide
Yeah,
if you wanted to.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I asked the same question in my head and it looked like, at least on the school in town, ours was increasing slightly more than the town, but there's just more investigation you'd need to do to be
Okay.
sure.
Again, this was presented yesterday at about noon time, so, I'm trying to give you the high level bits and pieces of data that I think you might be asked. And I'm hoping that this will help you to maybe be able to answer it or at least have something to refer to. Okay, any other questions on this slide? Or how we got to the 8.8? And I'm not saying that's what it's coming in at. I'm just saying this is the estimate and this is where the estimate came from.
So it's really important for everyone to not take the 8.8 as the final word.
This makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Okay, next slide. So now I'm going to go back up to above the line expenses. Can we go actually back 2 slides so I can orient everybody again? Go back to the towns, that one there. Okay, so again, we have gross revenue, which is the top line. Then we have this non-departmental fixed costs. And this included in this are the benefit costs. And one of the reasons why there's less revenue available on the net number that gets split between the town and the school is because there is some significant increases in the above the line expenses. And a huge driver in this is benefits. So I want to walk you through what was shared with us yesterday about what's happening on the benefits side. And I may not be able to answer all the questions, but I do want to at least walk you through so you understand what's happening in this middle section here, right? The above the line expenses. So if you can go back to benefits. Okay. So, and before we do go and look at this closer, I also want to say I had asked Melissa when the override analysis was done, what was the assumption that was made for benefits? And she said that they had, the assumption was a 6% increase in health insurance. In the current year, FY25, the costs went up by 10%, not 6%. And next year, they're estimating they're going to go up 12%. So 12% is twice what they expected. And it's compounded on a higher cost for this year. Okay, so that's really important to note. So these are the items, and I'm not going to read it line by line or anything like that, but at least it shows you what is in what's considered benefit costs above the line. So I'm going to give you a minute to just look at that because you didn't get to see this in advance. So I'll just give you a minute to look that over and process that.
Susan, can I ask one question about that? It looks
Sure.
like on the OPEB's line that they've reduced the OPEB obligation by 250,000 for the current year. Did they mention that? Was that discussed at all? Because it goes from 5.43 for the current year down to 5.18, then back up to 5.43.
A lot was covered.
Okay.
And I don't remember a lot of time spent on that. But it's certainly something we can ask about.
Okay. Thank you.
So what I'll do is kind of draw your attention down to the bottom where it says the $2 signs and change. And so it's increasing by $3.6 million, which represents a 4.1% increase overall in those lines. Again, the biggest driver, according to Melissa, is this group health insurance. And you can see that going from 38 million to 42.5 million is pretty significant. Right.
I'm sorry.
I don't know that I can answer any questions on this, but I'll give it the old college try if you have a question.
This is for the town side or for the school side or for both?
Both.
So when you say it goes up 4.5 million, that's for everybody.
Yes.
So we're getting about 60% of that on our books.
Well, it's taken off the top. So we have gross revenue, and then all these expenses are lopped off the top before we get a split. Yeah, but it does affect the amount of money that we have available in the split. It's just
So
taken out before the split. The calculation for the split.
can you
is
can you estimate the real impact on our side of the ledger?
I guess the best estimate would be the 60%, right? If you're just going by numbers, but I'd have to really know what is school versus what is town. I'd have to have Melissa go through and analyze for every employee that we have that's on health insurance versus every town employee. She can do it. I know she has the data, but I don't have that. I don't have access to that
Yeah,
data.
I'm not looking for precision. I just want to make sure I have the right ballpark.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Susan.
Either way, even if the town, even if there was way more town employees taking health insurance than the school department, it's not necessarily relevant in that the cost of benefits globally is subtracted before we get any revenue or the town departments get any revenue.
Right, I get it. I'm just trying to make sure I understand the extent to which this is a driver of the newly projected deficit.
It is, and I'm
No,
hopeful.
I know that. I definitely know that it is. I'm
Yeah,
just trying.
no,
I'm just
I think I'm
gauging in
gonna
my head how much of it is. So thanks.
yes, I think I'm going to get there.
Okay.
I think I'm going to get us there. Okay, okay, so why don't we go to the next slide, which then kind of gives some context to this. And you can just read this. I can't answer a question about it, but this is the information that was shared about those major account categories that are going up. It looks.
The note here on OPEBs is confusing because it doesn't match with what's on the slide. That's not a question for you. I'm just saying it doesn't match.
Yeah, and I can't speak to it.
Okay.
So we'll just go on to the next one. Again, I'm just providing the information. Certainly they can, we can ask these questions. Right now, I'm going to shift gears for a minute to get to the question I think Stephen was asking. In order to get there, I wanted to start with what assumptions were made and what did we anticipate we would get for funding this year. And so I'm gonna point you to the FY25 column. And if you look at the last number there, you see 137, 101, 490. So the schools were expecting to have that amount of money available to them to pay for our costs this year. We know that we didn't get that much money. So the assumptions that were made during the override caused the amount of money available to us in the current year to be less. Now let's look at 26. What we thought we were going to have available to us was 142,663. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to share with you again what those numbers came in at. So remember this, 142,663. We all see that? Our budget, when I showed you what my thumbnail estimate was and where that number came from, was 145. The difference in the expenses is $3 million. Okay, so our expenses are $3 million higher than what they thought they were going to be when the override budget was calculated. Okay, so that's, and we know $2 million of that is that structural deficit I've been talking about. All right, and some of that is expanded, some other expanded programming, and I'm not going to get into the details of that yet because Diane and I are still analyzing information. Our essential question is what is driving our costs to be higher than what we anticipated back then? That's the essential question we're asking. And we're still analyzing data to be able to try to answer that for you, but we don't have that for tonight. Okay, so now we're going to go on. So that's the expenditure deficit. We're going to call that the expenditure deficit as we go into 26 is 3 million. Now I'm going to talk about what I'm calling a revenue deficit. In other words, we anticipated we would have available, based on the projections provided during the override process, 142,663,000. What the town is telling us now is that they only have 139,627,000. So we have $3 million less in revenue available to us. It's really important to understand that, because it's not about school department spending that's created the $6 million. It is a factor, but it's not the whole factor. And so
Can I ask a question on that, Susan?
Sure.
So on the override revenue, is it all that above the line, or is there also some piece of this either in toto that we're not getting on the tax side, or in terms of the split that we're not getting that we anticipated on the override piece? I'm just trying to understand the override tax piece a little bit better, and whether there's something more than just the above the line at play.
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's not one that I can answer. I would have to get more information from Melissa in order to answer that. But what I can say is that a big driver of the reason why this $3 million variance is showing up on the revenue side is because of the benefits piece. It could also be that revenues are not coming in at what they had expected. And I don't know what all the assumptions were because it wasn't here at the time. But when I asked the question, Melissa attributes the majority of this deficit from these significant increases in benefits, both in 25 and in 26, that were far higher than what they were using as in their assumptions.
I think the other thing that we did not attribute, but that hit us last year and obviously is carrying forward, is the increased utilities attribution. That was $1 million last year, but that same modification, I think, carries forward, Susan, as well. Is that, am I correct in that, to your understanding?
Yeah, it does have an impact. It had an impact on the current year. It shouldn't have it on 26. Like we
Well,
should
but
have.
it's carrying forward. If we had a lower revenue last year, then there's an increase. It's sort of buried in our base from last year, right?
Yeah.
Or buried in the lack of base from last year. Okay.
Yeah. And so last year, when we were making adjustments, part of it was that our expense was higher, same as this year, right? Our expenses are coming in higher than what was anticipated during the override projection process. And likewise, on the revenue side, some assumptions that were made have not come to fruition. So it's a combination of both, and I think the public really needs to understand that. And this plays out on the town side too. So they're getting less revenue allocated to the town, and that's putting pressure on the town side. But I'm not here to speak to their side. I just want to make sure that you understand how it rolls out and impacts us. But it does affect the town side as well. Because obviously, if these expenses are taking above the line and we have less overall revenue than available to split, then they're short as well. And so if you look through the rest of their presentation, I think it's online now. It's quite lengthy. They do get into sanitation and what's happening there, and some of the drivers of their costs that are coming in higher than anticipated, and the impact of the lower revenue estimate as well. Is that clear as mud?
Any questions?
Yeah, hi, Jesse here. Is it the town revenue estimate is before the town school split? This is everything together before the schools?
Yes, so the net revenue is what is split. Yeah, so
Right.
yeah,
All right,
so
so
the,
town revenue is everything, the town.
correct.
Before anything goes to the schools, we're saying they're estimating $3 million less money coming in. Wherever
Yes,
the source, doesn't really matter where the sources are, just that's what they're saying.
that's
Got
what
it.
they're saying. I mean, yeah,
Got it.
this, yep.
Thank you.
And they did a really nice job on their slides. You can go in and see what are like local receipts and what the assumptions are there. And, you know, they actually gave some historical information on the local receipts. So you can see where they've landed over the last, I think they gave 3 or 4 years worth of actual data. And then they also projected out and gave their assumptions there. I thought they did a pretty nice job of that. If you have time, but I didn't want to lose this by getting into a whole bunch of other things that may or may not be important to understand without understanding this first. Okay. So that is, you guys are awesome. I thought it might take longer. So either my explaining's good or I've got you so confused now that you don't know what to ask.
I've got a question. So, is it accurate to say that we're going to have a better, or I guess what's the timeline from this point forward? In terms of revisions to revenue estimates, which are typically show up at some point from the town, and your refinements of actual budgets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as I said, budgets were due to us Monday. We're still missing some from some budget managers, so we're actively trying to work with them to get those complete. Once those are complete, and then I roll the staffing roster, so I would say, you know, we're hoping by Christmas time that we have a good, strong draft of FY26. And then internally, we will begin to discuss the implications. We'll begin actually that conversation with principals and directors and our administrative team on Monday afternoon. So on the towns, and then, you know, of course, we're going to be giving you, we can give you an update at the meeting in January. So we have a meeting, finance committee meeting on the 15th. So we'll definitely give you an update then on our side on where we're at, what things are looking like, and then I'll be able to give you a more refined number. Hi, Rita. On the town side, I know.
Can I ask just one follow-up on that?
Yep.
I was trying to pull up our calendar. Like there was a thumbnail presentation going to full school committee at some point, and then the full budget book in early February. I'm just trying to remember the dates because that's when you're starting, but I guess I'm wondering when we're gonna have a little bit more refinement.
Yeah, I'll give you a thumbnail
Okay.
that will be based on the roll up of our budget. I will give you that on the 15th. That's what I'm saying.
The 15th of, sorry.
January.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And yes,
And that thumbnail is different than this thumbnail though.
it is.
Okay, it's more detailed.
Yes.
Okay.
And it will be based, like, I'll be able to say, here's some of the real drivers on our side. I'll say, this is the impact of stepping column and contracts, you know, so I'll be able to tell you how much of our increase is attributed to that. I'll be able to give it to you in bigger bucket and in more buckets than you see here, but it will be based on actual data for the FY26, not just an estimate that I'm making.
Okay. On
All right.
our tracker, we had January 23rd because I think it's going to the full school committee and not just the finance subcommittee. So
Okay.
it
Well,
even gives you an additional
yeah,
8 days or whatever that math is.
I'm sure I will talk about it on the 15th either way.
I imagine. Okay. Sorry, is
And-
it Stephen or Helen?
But can I
Stephen, go.
finish with the timeline
Oh
though?
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so that's on our side. The next milestone really in terms of refining numbers is when the governor presents her budget, right? And so that is typically given before the end of January. And since we don't have a change in leadership at the state level, then she's required to have a budget presented, which is referred to as House 1, by the end of January. And so whatever estimates Melissa is using on the revenue side, we will have a number to plug in because we'll have the governor's number. Right now, she's level funding state aid. So whatever is put forward in House 1 will then be reflected in a revised estimate. In addition to that, I want to make note that there was conversation on the at the meeting yesterday about making some adjustments to some of my understanding is, and certainly Melissa will correct me if I didn't understand it, but I do believe I did, that they were talking about some of the policies that drive what goes above the line. So there's two parts to it. There's certain policies where they set aside a certain amount of money in order to achieve a goal. It could be to fund your OPEB expense. It could be because you want to have a certain target reserves of some sort. It could be that you have CIP that and capital projects that you're trying to have a recurring funding. So it could be a variety of things. I could go back and look, but I haven't been here long enough to know it by heart. But what they did talk about yesterday was, what if instead of appropriating, I'm saying $7 million, we appropriate $5 million next year, and then get back on track in out years, which would then free up $2 million to be available to support expenses. I think there's a little bit of an appetite for that because last year and this year, the revenue numbers aren't, that everybody relied upon when making choices and decisions for the override haven't materialized. And so it's very prudent for them to begin to have those conversations. They did say that they wanted to take it up at upcoming select board meetings, but I don't know when they'll docket it. So we should probably keep our eye on that moving forward, because again, any adjustments to the expense side or any change to the revenue side that's above that line will be favorable for all of us. So
Thank you.
that's their timeline and process, as I understand.
Thanks, Stephen, and then Helen after Stephen.
Okay, thanks. I have two questions. I'm afraid they might be a little dumb, so I apologize in advance. So, Susan, on an early slide, you had projected the deficit at 8 point something million, and on the last slide, it was 6 point something million, with the split being half due to revenue coming in at under expectations and half being on our side. Can you remind me what the difference between those two projected deficits? Can you remember what the difference is?
I can. We are getting more revenue than we did for this year. So we were just not getting enough new revenue, which is creating the revenue deficit. So when you take the 8.8 million, the difference between the 8.8 million and the 6 million is the new revenue we are going to receive.
Because the 8.8 is the increase year over year on budget. It's not the net deficit. Okay.
Exactly.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. And then the second question is, since half of the projected deficit is the result of our side, how much of this was known in advance of these meetings? I understand that we couldn't have projected healthcare cost increases, and I understand that we couldn't have projected revenue shortfalls on the town side. But how much, if any of this, were we aware of prior to the meetings that just ended?
I guess I'm not sure how to answer that question. The information that I've shared with you about having, the deficit in this year, I did share at the last meeting. So I think that was on our radar. Some of the other elements that I talked about tonight with the grants and having to reconcile that out is information that's, like kind of hot off the press and is in real time. As I'm learning it, I'm sharing it. So in terms of our structural deficit, there's a piece of that, but some of the work that Diane and I are doing is to try to answer that question about what is causing this, what do we attribute this $3 million to? Don't have an exact answer to the question yet, but we will share our learning over the next several weeks with you at the next meeting. But I don't have answers to all the questions. I can talk about things as I see them, and that's what I'm doing. But on the town side, I don't know,
Not on the town side. I mean,
Yeah.
on the school side.
Yeah,
It makes sense to me that we wouldn't have known anything coming on
Yeah.
the town side. I guess I guess I didn't even realize coming into this meeting that the school side projected deficit would be as steep as it is.
Mhm.
So I guess what's not clear to me is why we didn't anticipate it prior to now. I'm not sure what we learned recently that contributed to this projection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I'm not really sure how to answer the question.
This question to me
Um,
feels a little bit premature because Stephen, I think you're carrying the sort of the very rough calculations that are the 5% increase and assuming that this number is further along than it is. And
And
so
the
that's
5% increase is really the rough number that the town provided for us rather than us generating our own.
no, Susan used the 5% increase. And so
Mhm.
I think that and then the one number that Susan did add to that is the $2 million that is the 750 we've been talking. Can't remember if you've been at some of these meetings, but we've certainly been talking about it. And I think
I haven't, so
okay,
I
and
might be really late to this.
I think I reported on it in our Q1 meeting. And then the 1.2 million, which was just today. So there's the $2 million of that. Anyway, I guess my point is that I think that it's maybe a little bit early to ask for attribution and figuring out of everything except for maybe the 2 million, which has been articulated.
Okay, it may just be that I'm late to understanding this.
I mean, it's all new too. Like there's the only thing that we really talked about before was the 750 that was part of the $1.1 million deficit we were carrying in the Q1 report that, as Susan said, she thought some of it would melt because of the positions going unfilled and some of it they were looking into how to figure out, which we heard a little bit more about today. So
I see.
yeah, so I think that's my impression. Susan, does that
Yes.
does that comport with, okay.
I see.
Um,
Okay, thank you, Mariah. I appreciate that.
Sure. That's why I was saying earlier too, I don't want the huge headline to be $8.8 million deficit because I think we're just in such early days still about this is like a warning flag for us, but it is not the final number by any means. So we need to get a little bit further down the path on this. Helen?
Yeah, to continue with what you're saying, Mariah. First of all, there's two questions. There's a question I have and a statement. First question is, how much free cash was certified this year?
They haven't certified it. They said that they were pretty close.
And
I don't know it off the top of my head, Helen. I could go back to their slides and find it though.
that would be great to know
Yeah.
that if you can. The second piece is, so the town historically has always estimated very conservatively their revenues, not the expenditures, but the revenues. And you would, in past years, it would start out at one number and our numbers would grow
over the course, once the governor's budget came out, once the healthcare came in. And so I don't want to be Pollyanna in terms of all of this, but on the other hand, I think we need to keep that in mind, to know that they do budget very conservatively. And just, for those who haven't been through the process before, it's an important piece to keep in mind. So our revenues can go up, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you,
And
Helen.
hopefully our deficits will go down and we'll have less of a gap there.
Exactly.
How
With-
much is the free cash, Susan? Did you find
Oh.
that number?
No,
I just went back and looked at the presentation, and I don't think that the 24 certification was in there. I think they were just talking about, I'm not sure. I didn't see it, Susan.
there
because
is
the
no
year be-
certification. It has not been certified yet. They said that they were behind, but I thought that they did speak to it a little bit.
So in years past, it's ranged anywhere over the last 4 or 5 years. It's ranged from 8 to 16 million of free cash. Now that goes into the CIP usually, but last year we funded the CIP quite well for the next few years. So I'm wondering how that will work out.
They
And if
have a
that's what
slide. Yeah. They have a slide on free cash. It's slide number 15 in their presentation, but I don't even want to try to interpret.
they don't have a number.
They have a variety of numbers here.
Oh.
Unreserved fund balance is usually the number that I would be looking at. Their unreserved fund balance, which seems low to me. So free cash estimate is 23,500,000.
Whoa.
23,500,000. That's their estimate on page 15.
So
But
just
it's
so everybody
confusing.
understands how free cash ends up that way, if departments or people don't use the monies that were budgeted, it goes into free cash and then gets allocated, I think, the year after. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Now, we do have a policy to put a certain amount into the CIP, but if it's 23 million, that's way over.
Well, it's 23 million. If you look at their slide, I'm sorry that you can't see this. It's like I said, it's page 15 of the slide deck.
Oh, we can go back. I mean, this is just, we're not going to figure this out tonight, and that's fine. But I want people to understand all the different variables that go into getting the actual budget finished for 26.
That's very helpful. And I do think that number is ballpark, Susan, because I had heard 22 million was quoted to me at one point recently.
Yeah.
But that's really high compared to what we've had in the past. Really high.
And I don't know. And that doesn't mean because you have a free cash of 23 million that's all available, because there's set asides and there's reserves.
Oh, of course. I mean, we have to pay the debt from that. We have to pay, there's some things that, and a certain amount has to go into CIP.
I think
we
the
should just
free
keep our
cash,
eyes on it.
Helen, I think the free cash is more of an indicator of how much funding, how much revenue was unallocated in the prior year. And it represents a very conservative approach to budgeting. When we see those large balances, it means that funds weren't allocated because they're available in the future.
Right.
Now, they are used for other things, but I guess the point is, are we starving ourselves on our operating budget and creating much larger free cash flows than we had been in prior years? And I think there's a lot of debate about that, which we're not going to solve tonight, but certainly it's helpful for everyone to understand that there are multiple levers that operate on the revenue side, and that's one of them that people can consider. We have 15 minutes left. I would like to make sure, and Helen, there she goes, your hand, thank you. I want to check and see other questions that anyone else has, or our colleagues from advisory have, other members of school committee, anyone else who's here, before we wrap up. I'm going to take Carolyn first, who's on the subcommittee, and then go to Carla.
Thanks. Susan, in one of your, when you were talking about one of your slides in terms of explaining, you know, some of what's brought us here, you said something about, and I'm sorry, I don't remember what your words were, but the override projections being retrospectively. I guess I wonder if you could fill that out a little bit. I mean, I guess my sense was the override asks were and always are set as some, you know, sort of guesstimate of what can be useful while also politically feasible and palatable. And I don't know, having not been as involved at the time, like specifically what, if there were specific sort of buckets that were projected in terms of how those funds would be used. I guess I'm just thinking about sort of the public facing part of this. I'm trying to sort of, can you say again, I guess, what you said about override projections? I guess, were you saying that's just basically a piece of how we end up here?
Yeah, I would say we end up here because assumptions that were made at the time haven't proven to be what our reality is. I don't know how else to say it, right?
Okay,
So
no, that's fine. So just,
Yeah.
in terms of everything, yeah.
Yeah, and it falls in two areas. One is on that revenue side.
Yeah,
Some
okay,
assumptions were, haven't proven to, in practice, have not turned out to be, I don't want to say accurate because it's not fair when you're doing projections, right? It sounds so
I
judgmental.
understand. I think I understand what you're saying. And I'm not sure that, you know, anybody ever said or thought, look, override will be the answer to everything and we'll have nothing to worry about for 3 years. I'm not sure. So
What I can't dig in and what I am digging in on, and this was, I think, to your question, I think it's my question, I think we all have this question. What is driving that $3 million on the expense side? That's more than what we had anticipated during the override. That we hope to bring color to. Because if we don't know the answer to that, then we risk repeating.
Right.
And we don't need to do that. And we need to understand what kinds of things, are hanging there and where.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can't answer that yet. This is when I'm seeing this, I'm saying, okay, what's causing that? I have the same questions you have. We're working really hard to be able to try to answer that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you. Carla, before I call on you, can I just ask one follow-up question on that, Susan? I promise, Carla, I'll be right to you. We had deductions in our override plan. Was one of them supposed to be taken for 26? I can't remember right now. We were taking operating cost reductions. You had it up on that slide, that 24, 25, 26 slide.
Yeah, I can.
Is this one of the years where we were supposed to be taking, and I apologize, I'm just feeling so crummy that my brain is foggy and I can't even find my own copy of those slides right now. So just wondering if that's also an aspect of the 3 million where we're saying, oh, well, where were we? Why is it over? And it's because we had projected making reductions.
Well, I'm looking at the slide now.
Yeah.
And it's showing
Does it
Is
have
it
a deduction
whether-
under
oh,
26?
There's not a line that says deduction,
Can you
but
pull it up real quick, just so we
yeah,
can?
yeah. Betsy, it's on, oh, maybe
Sorry,
I can.
Carla, one sec.
It should say programmatic adjustment.
Yeah, the programmatic adjustment line.
line. Okay, wasn't sure which line. So
Yeah.
yeah, in 26, it says 2.95 million.
But what was the net from the year before? We had 1 point something million in there from the year before.
1.95 and
Million.
20.
So there was another $1 million net.
Oh, I
So
get you. Is
yes,
that how
so
you
then,
read that?
yeah,
Okay.
so that actually that sort of ties out with the 2 million plus the, but anyway. Okay, thank you for that. That's helpful, Susan. Carla, go ahead. I'm sorry for the delay.
No, not a problem. Just wanted to mention, as far as the free cash is concerned, that you all know there's this so-called waterfall. And just because there's a lot of free cash doesn't mean it all ends up in the CIP. This year, for example, some is going to end up in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund because the balance in the trust fund has gone below $5 million. And also, as Susan, I apologize. I don't know if you mentioned that one of the things the select board is considering is establishing a working group or committee to study expenditures and revenues. And this committee would be made up of a member of the school committee, a member of the advisory committee, a member of the select board, and then somewhere between 4 and maybe, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 community members. The name of the committee doesn't have override in it. The last committee that Chaz formed didn't have the word override in it either, but it was definitely a committee that was asked to consider an override, as this one will be asked to consider. So you can all start thinking about which member of the school committee you'd like to be on this committee that I imagine is going to be formed sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Other comments that people would like to make? Or questions? Ben, go ahead. If you're talking, you're still on mute.
Can I be heard? Yes, I hear myself.
Yes.
With all respect to you, Mariah, and your preface, and to the school committee, I'm wondering in regard to your preface, when do you expect to have a response to the story in the Brookline News? These kind of things fester and grow out, as you well know, and they're hard to catch if they get out too far. Have you got, I don't mean you personally, has the school committee or the school department got a plan for response?
I think I would turn that over to you, Dr. Guillory, if you're available to respond.
I'm not looking.
I have to apologize, Ben, but I have been sick. I'm now in my 2nd week of sickness, so I am just like not up to date.
Mariah, you never have to apologize to me.
No, I do. Linus, would you like to respond to Ben?
Sure thing. So the chair of the school committee is certainly working with me as well as looking at the claims that were made. And as soon as that process runs through, I'm sure there will be some form of a communication that goes out.
Okay. I would
Thank you.
simply suggest, as a man who did PR for a long time, that the sooner the better. Of course, one has to do it well and comprehensively, but the sooner is the better in these kinds of things. That's all.
Yes. Thank you, Ben.
Sure.
Okay, well, with that, I will say, Susan, thank you so much for this comprehensive update. And I know we all wish that it came in and everything was showing lots of revenues and all the expenses being covered, but unfortunately, that's not where we're at. But we appreciate you walking us through it so completely and looking forward to updates and refinements in January.
And I'm looking
Thank you.
forward to getting those to you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Have
thank
a good
you.
night, everybody.
Feel better, Mariah.
Thank you. I
Or drink
appreciate
some
it.
orange juice.
Bye.